So I'm going to talk through 10 years of putting social and economic value on volunteering, and mainly from using the new Treasury economics of well-being and the well-being, and I'll explain a little bit of that as well. There's some people on this call who've been part of all this work I'm going to talk to. I think you had Gethin on this morning, who Gethin Williams worked with me back in 2014 on this bit of work, which was this was for joining it, was putting a social economic value on volunteering in sport, and in doing it, it came out alongside probably the first bit of work ever, I think, to put a full national value on it, which was by Andy Haldane, who was the chief economist at the Bank of England. This is a bit of a trip down memory lane for me, this. The two numbers essentially fitted exactly, and in doing that work, we started to work with the chap in the photo there, who's called Gus O'Donnell, and I'd heard him on Newsnight talking about, it's quite a pertinent subject, how volunteering increases people's trust in one another, and trust in one another is the most valuable commodity in an economy because it reduces what's called transactional costs, and it's good for people's sense of purpose and sense of health and worthwhile. So it was all of this that we valued, and in doing it, you can see at the bottom right, we started to talk about a sort of a halo of social value where you measure. Essentially, there was the methodology that existed at the time was imagining that you had to pay the volunteers, which was the only way that it had been looked at up to that point. So that's the first area of value. Imagine if you had to pay them the minimum or the living wage. That's called cost replacement. And then it was the well-being value to the volunteer themselves, which is significant, and we'll talk a bit about that because there's been a lot of work done by DCMS in the last 2 months, actually, which I'll build up to. And then the third area is, in sport in particular, one volunteer was enabling about 9 people to play sport, so that has a value as well. So we were starting to use this new area of economics that was called well-being economics, and at the time it was described by the Treasury as interesting and experimental. So this was all quite avant-garde, really, but was the first time it had ever been done. But things have evolved quite a lot in the last 10 years. I used to have hair then. So here's the 10 years of what's changed. This is Gus O'Donnell at the launch of State of Life, and what he'd done back in about 2010, 2011 was start to create within the UK these huge national assets. Really, they're massive data sets that measure volunteering, but alongside our health, our age, our well-being, our sense of purpose, our trust, our sense of belonging, our loneliness, all of the other measures that pretty much any charity, any third sector organisation in the UK is looking to impact. We've been doing this 10 years. We've yet to work with a charity where the outcome isn't something that's already in these data sets that Gus had created, and the Office of National Statistics and lots of other people. But the main focus of this was to try to sort of shift and create a sort of rebalance the economy to measure not just GDP, but the health and well-being of the population. And it's actually been pretty successful. So 2018, page 5 of what's known as the Treasury's Green Book. Now, the Green Book is if you're spending a penny of public money, you need to abide by these principles. And for the first time, they've got this quite nice and clear definition of what social and public value is. And it's based on welfare economics. And you can read it in the top paragraph there, but it's essentially it's the money that changes hands plus the impact on the health and well-being of the population. So what was interesting and experimental is now on page 5, and it's become quite key in how we look at the impact of policies. And when the Treasury changes something significant in the Green Book, which is the Bible of any public expenditure, they issue what's called supplementary guidance. And this is, okay, if this is important, how should we measure and evaluate it? And Actually, the way we were doing this for 10 years is pretty much the recommended, if I say so myself, a little bit of a brag. The idea that we started with in 2014 is pretty much what's recommended in chapter 5, but probably the more important bit is the bottom, where for the first time what the Treasury's done is put economic value in a change to your well-being. So all of these data sets measure your well-being, and you can now attach an economic value to it. And that measure is called the WellBe. And for credibility purposes, it's really useful that it benchmarks to the NHS measure of economic value, which is the QALY. So if the NHS is going to prescribe you, when I'm downstairs, I was talking about the Ozempic, GLP-1 drugs. And if the NHS is going to prescribe them to you, it's got a cost of £3,000 a year. That's how much it costs. It's a lot of money. So they've got to figure out, is that good value for money? Is the weight loss or the health benefits, is it worth that much? And that's how they do it. They use a quality adjusted life year, a QALY, and that gives a value to a year in health of about £70,000. So in order to measure all this, we've got these world's leading data sets, and these are the ones that we use an awful lot. This is actually a slide from back in 2018. Understanding Society, the British Household Survey, measures volunteering really well alongside almost anything you can imagine. Huge data set, really important for the sort of analysis we do. There was 2 data sets were measuring volunteering in much more detail, was taking part in community life. And actually, I think last year they've merged. So I think it's all in community life now. And community life is got a lot of detail. We're looking at it as we speak, actually, and I'll talk a bit about why. But that's got all the details on not just what people are doing or what format of volunteering they're doing, but also frequency. And there's quite a bit in there on why people do it, the barriers, what they want out of it. So all of these are open. We don't own them. They're well worth knowing about, looking at. What do? We work in all sorts of areas now. I just thought I'd give this a bit of context because we started out in volunteering, but we've recently been doing the sort of social and economic value for Sizewell C, the massive nuclear plant. We worked with Duke of Edinburgh and Girl Guiding. We worked on the Tideway Tunnel. We train government economic services on how to measure and evaluate wellbeing in line with that chapter 5 from the Green Book. And we've been the first to run studies using the WellBe on the social and economic value of churches. I'd like to have to say a bit about churches. Churches are probably the fountain of most of our social care. We've got more food banks than McDonald's in this country, and there's not one of them that we can find that hasn't been set up, run, or hosted by a church. And you are much more likely to volunteer, well, significantly more likely to volunteer if you go to church. It's not the very trendiest subject to talk about, and I'm not particularly religious, but we've done a study called The House of Good on the social economic value of churches using the WellBe. That was the first study we did using that WellBe back in 2020, before it was actually published in the Treasury guidance. But we're measuring this every day of the week in those data sets. So a little bit about what's changed in volunteering. Back in 2019, one of the criticisms of the early world, or one of the queries, you always get this sort of the skeptics that will go, yeah, is it volunteering that's good for people, or is it just that happier people are the ones who volunteer? So we thought we'd answer that question, and to do that you have to do complex analysis of understanding society. But we did that work. We called it Happy Days. Volunteering is really, really good for you. Probably one of the best things you can do. You also help other people, which makes it incredibly valuable. It's particularly good for your sense of purpose. Is what you do in your life, do you think what you do is worthwhile, which is a big driver of your well-being and your life satisfaction. So yes, volunteering did make you happy. This was back in 2019. We then worked for the UN on taking that approach that we've done for Hidden Diamonds and Join In, and tried to suggest this may be a way to look at it globally. using the similar methodology. I hasten to add, it's the same methodology that Andrew Haldane had used when he was at the Bank of England. Recently, if anyone's here from Scotland, we were asked to look at volunteering in Scotland, and we said, well, it won't be any different to the UK. And they went, doesn't matter. We want to use the Scottish Household Survey, not the British Household Survey. And you can see the figure is almost, as we sort of slightly predicted, to be honest, but it's reassuring when these findings are consistent. The value is almost the same. The wellbeing value using the Wellbe, pretty much the same as it's found in the rest of the country. We then looked at frequency, and I think this is something that's changed. It's really interesting at the moment. So if you look at the bottom of that table, and I apologize, it's not the most legible, but what we looked at was that it's the weekly frequency for most things in life. So the sort of one of the secrets to your well-being is regular, purposeful, weekly, collective endeavors. Might be going to church, you might be playing sport, it might be volunteering. The interesting thing was if you do all three of those, you can add the benefits together. But weekly as the most effective and most valuable was pretty clear coming out of the data. And then just last month, DCMS have, which I think they probably should have been doing, if I'm honest, back when we were doing all this work back in 2014, DCMS have looked in all these data sets and done pretty much the same thing that we've been doing for the last 10 years. They've used the same method of cost replacement, the same sort of halo of value, and they're arriving at, again, very, very similar figures. The figure you'll see in the bottom left there is saying its wellbeing benefit is £700, so lower, but they've only counted people who volunteer once a year, not weekly, not monthly. So we're digging into this as we speak for a project with the Community Leisure UK around volunteering in leisure centres, just to figure out if that's still the case, or since COVID, is weekly volunteering not as good for you, which is what this report seems to suggest. But this is brand new. I think this is from, for dates right, I think it's around July this year. So we've just come across it. We haven't looked at it in any detail, but the main point really, if I'm being brutally honest, is it all says the same thing. Volunteering is one of the best things you can do for you. It's really consistent. It pretty much holds up to the most any analysis you put it through. Volunteering is a really strong value for the individual, and obviously then you can go on to value who they might be helping to play sport, drug and alcohol support groups, which we've done for churches, food banks, which we've done for churches. These are all enabled and led by volunteers, but it's really good for the individual. Now, this is work that you're joined later by somebody who's much cleverer than me. It's Helen Timbrell, and this was some of the work that she helped kick off when we were at, she was at National Trust, actually. So a lot of the time people talk about, well, if it's good for everybody, what about diversity? Is it better for particular demographics? Are there barriers and benefits that are different for different demographics? And both of these studies use those same data sets to look at them, to look at those concepts and look at the data and answer those questions. And the fact that it was a really interesting study, this. It was, I think Helen had managed to bring together, I think it was Cancer Research UK at the same time, Cancer Research UK, British Telecom, Sport England. You're more likely to volunteer if you're higher socioeconomic, but the benefits are greater for low socioeconomic groups. And there was around motivations, they were quite different. So it was more altruistic from higher socioeconomic groups, whereas the lower socioeconomic groups, it was a lot around gaining skills. We then worked with St John's Ambulance, looking at why people volunteer for St John's Ambulance, and that was all about getting skills for working in health professions. So there's a lot around, you'll hear a lot at the moment from policy circles around skills and productivity. Volunteering is a really useful tool here. So if you want to, don't think it doesn't apply because it's not paid work. the role for volunteering around productivity and developing skills and leading to employment has been there for a long time, particularly amongst lower social groups and actually younger people, obviously. Diversity, we'd always been told, well, we'd get we often respond to sort of good criticism by saying, well, let's have a look, we'll find out the answer for you. And one thing was, you know, we would hear that I got in trouble at a conference, which I often do, talking about diversity and volunteering, and somebody said, well, you know, it's people from BAME groups don't volunteer as frequent. And I said, well, that's a really horrible thing, you know, lazy thing to say, because BAME makes up all sorts of different demographics, ethnic groups. It's a lazy sort of term. I got into loads of trouble for that. So we broke it down and we looked at the volunteering rates for all ethnicities, and it was a mixed method study. It was really interesting. We found that there was only one group that were underrepresented, which was Southeast Asian women, and we just did focus groups and talked to groups of those, and it's mainly just to do with the role in the household and a bit of sort of, you know, the men not wanting if I'm being honest, this is quite a clear finding. Please do read the report, so I'm going to paraphrase this in a way, but it's in a cultural issue. It's not a question of want, lack of willingness. It's just the way that it worked in the culture was that the men were volunteering, but the women were not allowed. Is probably a bit harsh, but that was the main finding. The questions around underrepresentation were not accurate. Everyone's volunteering at the same rates. There's huge cultures of volunteering in Muslim faiths. There's just the same study for the House of Good is applied to mosques and gurdwaras. Everyone's doing the same things. It's a human trait. It's not something that we should be segmenting by different ethnic groups. I think the final thing, I haven't talked about this for such a long time, but I'd argue quite strongly it's probably the best work we ever did. As I said at the start, volunteering was our first love, but we don't get to work on it quite as much as we'd like to anymore. And this was just a follow on to say, well, if volunteering is one of the best things people can do, and it's incredibly valuable to the economy, you know, like the same economic value as the entire city of London, which is, gets a lot of column inches and gets talked about all the time. How do we look at why people do it, and why, particularly perhaps why they don't do it? And this was mainly used in community life, and like I said, it's got these indicators around why people volunteer and why they don't. And I think the first thing, I mean, I know Ruth's on the call, and people, you know, probably a lot of what you do, and Helen's talk is around, you know, people who are managing volunteers, recruiting volunteers, trying to sort of, I guess, make volunteering more productive in many ways. The thing that we thought was, a lot of the talk back in those days was of volunteers were talked about as a workforce, and they're not. They're giving their time to you. And I think the way we were trying to frame it was, we work for them, because they don't have to turn up. They're not paid to turn up. You can't fire them if they don't. It's a reciprocal relationship where we have to work for them to make the experience really good. And so that's what we were trying to do with givers. And we found that the most important thing that they want, or one of the most important things, was just a thank you, just a bit of recognition for what they do. And this is just a bit of a brag as well, but we did a big thank you at Sports Personality of the Year for joining, and it beat the X Factor final on Twitter at the time. This is how old I am. It was called Twitter then. But really, it's just it was about these things. We tried to break it down into a little moniker that you could remember. It's what people did in those days. I feel so old. So really, Givers stands for growth. People want to grow from the experience. They want to know. They might be doing it for skills, like we just said, particularly young people. Impact. They need to know if they're volunteering for you. Tell them the difference they're making. That's why they're showing up. Ultimately, most people are doing it because they want to, for a cause that they care about. So they need to know that what they're doing and their time is making a difference. V was for voice. We said perhaps don't ask people to volunteer, because it can be a bit of a off-putting word. ask them if they can lend a hand or help out. And most people like to be asked to help out. They don't particularly like the role volunteer as a word. So voice and language was important. The experience you give to them, easy, enjoyable, recognition, just saying thank you was really important. That was probably the number one thing. And I think the other thing was social. And I think at a time where back then no one was really talking about loneliness as a sort of such a big issue, but it's probably one of the biggest negatives on your well-being and life satisfaction is being lonely. There's different types of loneliness. We've looked at this for churches, existential, social loneliness. Brilliant for loneliness is going to church, but volunteering is the only thing alongside going to church. Formal volunteering is the only thing we found to have a statistically significant effect on loneliness. Nothing else holds. We've actually sent that. I should probably put it in the chat, but I haven't got a link to it. But it's on our website if you want to see it. It's the only thing we found. We sent it to DCMS to say you should do more on this. Volunteering is brilliant for loneliness. And that's it really. I think the only thing I was going to sort of say was we're starting to put these sorts of findings into calculators for people like the FA and for churches. You can go on now as if you're a church and tell us what you do, and it will tell you what your social value is to the community. And it's really trying to take all these national economics that it's beyond most people, and it's bloody confusing for everybody. So we're trying to automate that as much as possible for interested organizations. And what you can do with this sort of economics, you can talk about your church. Let's take churches as an example, or you can do your football club, and it counts volunteers, players, and it starts to talk about what you might be worth to your local council in terms of social care and health. We're using it to protect playing fields from being sold off. With churches, you're trying to sort of say, look, nobody funds churches. They're providing more social care than anybody else in the country. They're frontline drug and alcohol support, food banks. If they weren't doing it, the council's got to pick the tab up. So we're trying to sort of use that to sort of say, can we start having a little bit of forget this separation of church and state and start, you hear all this talk about system change and place-based investment. It's like, well, they're staring you in the face. These sports clubs and churches have been doing this stuff for centuries. And yet we keep insisting on, NHS strategy calls for new health centres. Like, go to the church. They're doing it already. It's all this sort of, let's sound like we're doing loads of stuff, but ignore the blindingly obvious. And one of the blindingly obvious things we think is volunteering. It's just the big society idea needs to come back. It was great at the time, but it was buried in this horrible around austerity and cutting everything else. But the idea itself was probably quite right. It's what churches are doing. It's what all volunteers are part of. But it just needs to be invested in. So that's why we start to talk about this stuff. And that's it. I can answer any questions if I'm able to.
Thanks, Will. I think it's worth mentioning me and you have been talking about a social value calculator for Team Kinetic for quite a while, and we should be picking up that conversation again in the very near future when you get 5 minutes. 5 minutes piece. There's a few points, a few questions in the chat, and if people want to pop more in, please do.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see those. Yeah, let me have a look.
But I can pull them out if you will, if you want. There's an interesting one here about motivations and the difference between the expressed motivations and the unspoken. And could it be that some are more practiced at expressing what they believe is expected or socially acceptable? So that social bias of what people tell you the motivation versus what actually does.
No, that's an interesting one. What has been found? Gosh, this is a big research question. So we often will work with qualitative researchers, but if you're in a focus group, you'll tell people what they want to hear. But in an online survey, which is ultimately what we're doing, people are much more honest, especially around these biases and confirmation bias and optimism bias is what is the sort of statistical terms. So no, I don't believe that is the case in the online surveys. No one's watching. You're not being judged for it. You're not in a group where you think, oh, I ought to say this. The questions that are used are all pre-validated and tested for bias. That's the talk I was giving downstairs. It's, if anyone's telling you that these questions lead to bias, they've all been tested. All these big data sets, understanding society, taking part, it's good, validated questions. Yes.
Wendy, you've started the conversation. Wendy's got a hand up. It's coming
Yeah,
straight up on that response. Go for it, Wendy.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all, Will. I think it's absolutely, I don't think the questions will be biased at all, and you're right. Being online survey, you're much more likely to get it. It's just an interesting thing that I think as volunteer managers, we sometimes come across, I'm going to word this very carefully because I think I get into trouble as well sometimes. Sometimes we'll come across people who maybe themselves don't understand what their need is. And I've often found it in, like, dare I say it, retired professional men who actually have a need to feel important because they've lost that status, they've lost that role in life. And actually the volunteering is something that they need. And you can really use all the skills that they're bringing. But if you don't satisfy the need in volunteers' motivations, whatever they might be, then that's where they don't get what they need from volunteering. But it's a conundrum. I don't know if it can be solved if people themselves don't know.
There's a brilliant book. Where, and it is actually brilliant. I hesitate to use that word sometimes, but it's really good. It's by Will Storr, and it's called Status. And it talks about the governing principle of everyone's behaviour is actually status. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting to look at volunteering at that point. I think you're probably right about retired blokes. They probably need to be in charge. But yeah, I think volunteering does give people status. It makes them feel a really strong sense of purpose. Yeah. And often, feel good about themselves. So that's what's good about it. That does come with a flip, which is some people like to be in charge, which is probably your retired males who are used to being in charge because we're all entitled bastards. But yeah.
Wendy, I have no idea what causes trouble when you say things like that in conferences. I can't imagine that ever causes any kind of issue anyway. And Helen, you mentioned about the other work you did alongside the work that Will's put on. If you got to pop a link into them into the chat, that'd be great. I'm sure people would love to be able to see the sort of the other work that surrounded that, what you did when you were at the National Trust.
Yeah, it was good. Then, did do that. Yeah.
We're coming up to Kat, and Kat, I think Kat's not so much a question as a statement that it's important to make sure they've got robust social value calculations to encourage that kind of corporate sponsorship funding bids. Can you talk a little bit, Will, to the challenge you have of making people believe the data? Because it does produce big numbers, and it can be problematic sometimes, those numbers, because it's easy to dismiss sometimes, I guess, when it's that big number. How you help paint the picture, how you help take it beyond the number.
Yeah, you often have to couch it to, if they don't believe it. So that hugely helpful is why I talked through the 10 years. Back in 2014 when we were doing this, we were probably pushing it a little bit, but now you've got Treasury guidance that's got these figures in there. I think it's always important to, you can use the figures, but we try and always add in a bit of context. Volunteering has got similar value and outcomes as I think at one time it was like shifting from unemployed to employed. So you try and put it in context. The Treasury guidance has been hugely helpful in that regard, just from a credibility point of view. The other thing is it benchmarks to the way the NHS measures your health and well-being using a QALY, which is very similar. It's based on surveys. So methodologically, you're aligning to probably the country's biggest area of expenditure and economic valuation. So you can give a QALY value for volunteering straightforwardly now. With all those figures I've given you, we can say the NHS would pay, it's around £200 for every volunteer to get the health benefits that they get themselves. So you can start to use different, because it's so become much more embedded. You still have people question the numbers, don't get me wrong. But you've got much more of a leg to stand on. You're using Treasury guidance. And then it often helps to give it a human angle. Like ask them what's their hobby. And they'll say, I don't know, like golf. And you go, okay, COVID's happening again. You're banned from golf for a year. How much would you pay me to lift the ban? And the golfers will go, whoa, that's quite a lot. And then you go, all right, well, why would you pay me to lift a ban on golf? Well, it's time with my mates, time out of the house. I'm like, oh, would you say it's good for your mental health? Yeah. Would you say it's good for your well-being? Yeah, I would. Yeah. Okay, give me a figure. And they'll go, £3,000. I'm like, well, funny enough, that's exactly what it's worth. You know, there is a value to your well-being that people are willing, but you've got to make it personal to them often. That helps.
I think if you take the work that Will's talking about here, and then you go and listen to the session that Joanna's doing on the other side of this, which is very much around those personal stories, I think you've got a really nice methodology to be able to compare and contrast and tell a story that's nuanced and helps paint that picture of that value, and connecting the value with the personal is the secret. And I guess that's my next question for you, Will. I was there when the Giver stuff came out all that time ago. And the bit that I really liked about it was how you took those findings and then used behavioural science to try and work out what the appropriate messaging and nudging may be.
Yeah.
I know it's a long time ago, but I was wondering if you could maybe speak to a little bit of that, how you were able to use the data to sort of then improve the outcome, if you will.
Yeah, it's partly why we didn't get to do as much as I would have liked with it. If I'm honest, I think it's massively underused as a tool. I think it would probably stand up. We did the thank you and showed how important it was for and the fact that it went so big showed that people do want a thank you and want to give it. All the other things, I don't think it ever became as embedded as it could have been in terms of a methodology for doing what works with volunteers. But if you go through your volunteer management, you'll probably be doing all of them. There'll all be things that come fairly naturally in common sense. I'd have loved to have spent time doing nothing but that, but it just didn't turn out the way the business went, really. If I'm honest, it's the behavioural science is we work with the behavioural economics unit at LSE, and I think that it's a bit of a lesson there, because what actually happened with behavioural science and nudges was it wasn't really certified. It wasn't written up in any Treasury guidance like the wellbeing stuff is, and people in marketing and advertising started to claim that what they did was behavioural science, and it became hugely devalued as a discipline. So everyone talked about nudges. It was really robust. There was the nudge unit, the behavioral insights team, and they still do good work, but it became, because they hadn't sort of established it as a discipline, and it was relatively easy to claim you could do it. Loads of charlatans just started. There's one from Ogle. I can't remember his name now. I really don't like the bloke. He's like this ultimate opportunist. And he was like, yeah, what we do is behavioural economics advertising. You're like, what? You just make TV ads, you dickhead. You know, it became devalued, unfortunately. So it was very en vogue at the time, but it suffered from what the market can do to things. Is like take a good idea and kill it very quickly by
its own success.
Yeah, it devalues it. It devalues it. It's less of a risk with wellbeing, but it is still a risk. It's one that we have a little collective with LSE and Pro Bono Economics where we try to sort of address the credibility of it all, so that doesn't happen. And it's why we run the government training to some degree as well.
I think as well with those nudges, the more the nudge gets used, the less effective it becomes over time, because people become immune to it. So it's the kind of thing that, you know, the whole part of behavioural science is A/B testing and working out what's effective in a particular context, and certain things got used to death as an example. Coming up towards the end of the session.
Oh, sorry, go on.
So coming to the end of the session, I just want to make sure if anybody in the room's got any questions for Will whilst we've got him. And I did put in the chat, Will, who'd be interested in a social value calculator built into Team Kinetic, and the response was emphatic. So we will definitely be picking up that conversation again very, very soon. All right, guys. Thank you, Will, for your time. Always a pleasure to catch up, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Thanks, everybody. Hello to all those that I know. See ya.